Let me begin by setting the stage. You know, in the years after the Second World War, when the cries for national unity against international fascism were increasingly being replaced with cries for racial and social justice at home, it was Lillian Smith. Lillian Smith was the most progressive and outspoken of mainstream Southern writers on the need for a more just South, when others were charting a cautious course on racial change and calling for a more humane treatment within a segregated system. Lillian Smith, nearly alone among her colleagues, boldly and persistently articulated an entirely different vision of a completely desegregated South. And so following her death in 1966, the Southern Regional Council established an annual award in her name to recognize authors such as Alice Walker, such as Pat Conroy, Alex Haley, and John Lewis, authors whose work carries on the tradition of Lillian Smith, work of outstanding moral vision and literary merit which honestly portrays the South, its people, its problems, and its promise. And for the last several years, this award has been presented as a partnership between the Southern Regional Council, which established the award, the University of Georgia Libraries, which house the Lillian Smith papers. There is the Georgia Center for the Book, which presents the Decatur Book Festival, and for the fourth year, Piedmont College, which operates the Lillian Smith Center in Clayton, Georgia. Now, for the last few years, it's been my pleasure to serve as convener for a distinguished panel of jurors who every year work their way through scores of books that are nominated for this award. And convening these jurors is like having the opportunity to audit an advanced graduate seminar led by some of the finest scholars that our region has produced. And so over the years, I've noticed a few trends. One of them is an apparent recognition that in telling the stories from our region, the truth is often more interesting than fiction, especially in the hands of some of the authors that we've come across. Another thing that I've noticed is that because there is so much good work produced every year by Southern authors and about the South, that somebody has to take on the job of shining a light on work which, while excellent, may be in need of a little more attention, and that's been a focus of our jurors. And I think that may be what happened to the race beat in 2007. This momentous account of how the nation's press, after decades of ignoring issues of race and civil rights, came to recognize the importance of the civil rights struggle and turn it into the most significant news event of the 20th century. With all of the attention that this book received at the time it came out, including a Pulitzer Prize, the race beat could hardly have been described as underappreciated. And the attention that it did receive was justly deserved. Where else could you find a discussion of the connection between Gunnar Myrdal, Harry Ashmore, and the nation's newspaper reporters and editors? Where else would you find a moment-by-moment account of the Emmett Till trial and its aftermath? Where else would you find a detailed description of the beating of the African-American reporter on the steps of the Central High School in Little Rock? Where else would you find an account of what reporters were thinking and how they were motivated as they covered these and other momentous stories? And so tonight, to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Lillian Smith Book Awards, we present to you the author of The Race Beat, the press, the civil rights struggle, and the awakening of a nation, a native of Alabama, a reporter and editor for more than 35 years at the Mississippi newspapers, the Boston Globe, and the Philadelphia Inquirer, before serving as managing editor of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, who currently is a professor at Emory University, where he directs the Georgia Civil Rights Cold Case Project, which served as the inspiration for his cold case podcast series, Buried Truths, whose first season focused on the violence that was visited on black people in 1948 as they attempted to vote in Georgia's previously all-white Democratic primary, and which will soon be embarking on a second season. Please welcome Hank Klibanoff.
Well, thank you, Charles. That was beautiful. And since you made it possible for me not have to bring up the fact that I didn't win the Lillian Smith Book Award. It's a privilege to be invited here tonight, and as we celebrate the 50th anniversary of the award, this seems to be the right place at the right time to pay tribute to the award, but also to the person after whom it is named, Lillian Smith. Since the award was created in 1966, as you've heard, the commitment of time and energy and brainwaves to decide on an annual winner has been incalculable. The award goes to books that are outstanding creative achievements, worthy of recognition because of their literary merit, moral vision, and honest representation of the South, its people, problems, and promises. That's what they seek, and that's what they get. The list of winners is luminous, and the book award they gave the year that the Race Beat was eligible was fantastic and an absolute worthy winner. I'm especially pleased to be speaking to you tonight because my inviters had to overlook, accidentally or intentionally, 2 items on my CV that formed the arc of my career. One is that in my first years as a newspaper reporter following graduate school, I worked in Mississippi for 2 newspapers, one of which was the Delta Democrat-Times in Greenville, Mississippi. The paper owned and run by Harding Carter Jr., that was Big Harding, as he was known, who won the 1946 Pulitzer Prize for his editorials and who was a tough battler for change in the South. He died the year I arrived in Mississippi, but his career was, to my mind, a legacy of courage worth studying and learning from, modeling, and by the time I had the opportunity to write the Race Beat, to co-write it with Gene Roberts, it was an opportunity to show Harding Carter to a larger audience. 30 years after going to Mississippi for 6 years, thinking that I would probably never return south because I would not find the right newspaper, I did. And in 2002, I came to Atlanta to work as managing editor for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, Ralph McGill's newspaper. Ralph McGill, whose column ran in the Constitution 365 days a year, every day, had been, as you know, a bold and clear, worldly and brilliant spokesman for the progressive South. He won the Pulitzer Prize in 1959. So my professional life in newspapers, about 35 years, began at Harding Carter's paper and ended at Ralph McGill's. And that merits mention tonight because these 2 editors, who I'd always thought of as being courageous in their willingness to take on massive resistance, who delighted at poking fun at the troglodyte behavior of white resistors, and who put themselves at risk by advancing a liberalism that some mighty dangerous people thought was radical. These 2 crystal clear voices from the South had a common adversary and antagonist, Lillian Smith. To Lillian Smith, Ralph McGill and Harding Carter were pretenders in the practice of progressivism. I don't know if she ever used the word cowards to describe them, but indeed they had both signed up on the wrong side of history by opposing federal anti-lynching legislation. In the early years, the pre-World War II years, they had shown a predisposition to counsel patience. It was McGill, after all, who in 1942 wrote that the race problem, the, quote, Negro problem, as he put it, was, quote, economic almost entirely, and not at all a social equality problem. And then he added, anyone with an ounce of common sense must see that separation of the 2 races must be maintained in the South. He, of course, evolved and went more in the direction of Lillian Smith, not that she didn't remind him that he was still not where she wanted him to be. She thought that was preposterous. She was much more optimistic than that. Why, in 1949, she predicted that in 5 years, her words, there would be little legal segregation left in the South. Now, if her Ouija board started rattling and rolling to tell her something dramatic would happen in 1954, she was spot on. But the Supreme Court's Brown decision did not mark the end of legal segregation in the South. It only signaled the beginning of a bloody fight to the death. She did revise that prediction, by the way. In 1951, 2 years later, she wrote, 10 years from today, racial segregation as a legal way of life will be gone from Dixie. Now that would have been 1961. Alas, by 1961, as we know, massive resistance and the bulwark of segregation had not gone away. They had only intensified. But how can I or anyone fault any of these incredible Southerners, these analysts of the Southern condition, these believers in the South? They were full of conflict about their beloved yet benighted land, the South. They were, to use Lillian Smith's metaphor, constantly balancing and bargaining what they despised about the South with what they loved about it. McGill wanted his critics from the right to understand he did not come to his perch or to his perspective easily. In 1948, he went to Philadelphia to cover the Democratic National Convention. It was an important convention. He watched as the Southern Democrats, who had soon after formed the Dixiecrats, the states' rights party, they bolted from the convention. And he would write, "My immediate Confederate ancestors and my Welsh ancestry, which causes me to weep over sad pictures, books, and lost causes, are so much a part of me that when I sat down to write the story of the Southern demonstration at the Philadelphia Convention, I was so emotionally upset that I had trouble writing it fast enough." The Dixiecrats, he'd said, were supported by fear, not principles, motivated by forces and money which for years have supported every reactionary in the South. They do not represent the South. They are a minority's minority. But, and here he signaled his own conflict, but, he said, they do represent many Southern fears. So he would not have won sympathy from Lillian Smith, though I do think he would have accepted it if she had offered it. Their battles were known to those who cared about it and who were pained by it or who delighted in the schism. But most people back then didn't know, and what matters most is that they and Harding Carter and Emory Jackson, the editor of the Birmingham World, and Harry Ashmore and Hazel Brandon Smith and Julia Harris and many other Southern editors, black and white, were speaking up and speaking out. And they were using the bully pulpits of their columns and editorials to model what courage looked like. That alone separated them from the pack. McGill and Carter became increasingly outspoken among Southern editors, and Lillian Smith did the same among Southern writers. Now, maybe one measure of how insignificant their squabbles are today is that I am here tonight, an acolyte of Harding Carter and Ralph McGill, an extoller of them in the race beat, speaking at a Lillian Smith event. And I'm here to talk about courage, cowardice, and now contrition. Now, I want you to know that title just rolled out of my head when I was pressed for one. I knew exactly what I meant at the time. Of course, in a busy day, in a busy life, I didn't write down my swirling thoughts. So here I am trying to reconstruct what led me to that. Don't misunderstand, there's no shortage of exemplars of any of those. I just wish I had some flashback to which led me to that moment of inspiration. But I do know this. I have been remarkably fortunate to have been asked to do two things in my life that led directly to my exposure to courage, cowardice, and contrition around the most contentious and intractable issue of our lifetime, race in America. One was to join Gene Roberts, my editor at the Philadelphia Inquirer, in hunting, gathering, and writing the race beat, the press, the civil rights struggle, and the awakening of a nation. The other was to join WABE in producing a podcast based on the Georgia Civil Rights Cold Cases Project that I direct and teach at Emory. Both projects introduced me to the stories of people who, in their own way, crystallized what courage meant. Those of you who have had the opportunity to listen to the first season of Buried Truths, we tell the story about Isaiah Nixon. 1948, critical election in Georgia, coming off the contentious and comedic three governors controversy. And he, of course, was killed on election day of the Democratic primary in 1948 because he voted. I'm going to play just the first 3 minutes of the podcast, if you don't mind. Thank you.
Somewhere around here is where it happened. Somewhere in this beautiful expanse of Georgia woods, something terrible, tragic, and long forgotten, except by those who lived it. As I walk through the dry leaves of this forest, the sun flickers through the tall pines like a strobe. We're in Alston, in South Georgia. This land used to be a farm, owned by a black family, the Nixon family. 3 generations of them lived in a wood farmhouse with a tin roof, somewhere on this property, 70 years ago. It was a pretty good-sized farm, 59 acres. They raised crops. They traveled by horse and wagon, and they relied on a mule named Della. And this is where 2 white men drove up to Isaiah Nixon's farmhouse in the late afternoon of Election Day in Georgia, September 1948. They had guns in their hands. They had menace in their voices, and they insisted on seeing the farm. So Isaiah Nixon emerged from the house. His mother, his wife, his children watched as he stepped down off the porch and walked toward the men. Understand now, he knew them. He'd grown up with them. And they had their guns out? Their intent became clear when they asked Isaiah Nixon 2 questions. Had he voted? And who for? Now, as I walk this land, I can't help but wonder where exactly Isaiah Nixon was standing when he answered those 2 questions, when he refused to take a ride with them, and when one of the white men shot him 1, 2, 3 times in front of his family. I'm going to tell you that story and more about what happened on this election day in 1948, the history that led up to it, and the history that followed it. But now, in these silent woods, I hear the voices of people who have shared their memories with me about that time, that day, this place.
She begged him not to go because she knew the possibility that he was going to be killed.
He told him that if he knew what was best, that he wouldn't vote.
I felt like they probably done it murder.
So we know who did it, we know what happened, we know when and how, we know it was somewhere around here. But there's one remaining question. Why? Why did these men, why did so many men like them get away with murder in the South? Who were we? Who were we as a people that we allowed this to happen? That's our search. And this is our story. Because when we understand who we were, we can better understand who we are. This is Buried Truths. I'm Hank Klibanoff.
So through this, and as well as through the opportunity to write the race beat, I met people who I thought were emblematic of courage. I met people who I thought were emblematic of cowardice, and people who felt great contrition for things they had done. I want to talk about courage first. And this morning, as it just, and over the last few days, just sort of bouncing, who do I feature? Who do I feature? And I don't know why, but the one person who came to mind was not anyone you've probably ever heard of. Her name is Daisy Gabrielle, and she was in New Orleans. And she was a mother who was watching her school desegregate and watching all of her neighbors and friends decide to not send their kids there. She was white. She had a 6-year-old daughter. She had, I think, 6 children in all. She was 42 years old. And she was appalled that they were bolting from the school. She didn't understand why. And Sitton was there. Claude Sitton from the New York Times was there, watching her as Mrs. Gabrielle walked hand in hand with her 6-year-old daughter toward the school, while hecklers pushed close in around her, shoved Mrs. Gabrielle, and as Mrs. Gabrielle recited the 23rd Psalm as she approached the school. Why would she do this? Why, especially with her 6-year-old daughter in front of this mob? She said to Claude, and it went into the New York Times, "It isn't the fault of these colored people that they were brought here. If you uproot a people, there's a penalty for it. This is a penalty the South has to pay." A woman had told her that she was making a spectacle of herself and sacrificing her neighbors. So she told Sitton, "I told her, when it comes to sacrificing my neighbors or my principles, I'd sacrifice my neighbors. Neighbors change. Principles never do." And I thought, she merits certainly much more than just being mentioned in a speech on courage, but that's the least I can do tonight, is to resurrect this memory of this courageous woman. I'm thinking, too, of a young black woman from a small town in Alabama, a town named Shiloh. She was the oldest of 10 children, a graduate of a black college who decided in 1952 that she wanted to get additional education in journalism. So Autherine Lucy applied to the University of Alabama. Now, I know that the college admissions process takes a long time, okay? But if you have children going through this, count your blessings, all right? Because it took Autherine Lucy 1,243 days to finally get admitted to the University of Alabama. That's more than 3 years. And she did it only because a federal judge said the University of Alabama had to admit her, okay? She got in. That's monumental. She got in. She broke the barrier. In 1956. She started in 52, gets in 56, and over a 4-day span, she had attended 2.5 days of classes. So the Autherine Lucy story is about courage, but the story was not over, and it became about something even more important. Miss Lucy attracted quite a turnout to welcome her on the Alabama campus, but this was not freshman orientation. By the time she got there on the 3rd day, she was greeted by an angry, belligerent mob, which was by all appearances ready to kill her. She was brought to the campus and to her classroom building by a car. And from a position where he could see it unfold, a New York Post columnist, Murray Kempton, surely drawing on his trademark pipe, watched as she got out of the car and, in his words, went into the bear pit. She walked up the stairs of the building where her class would be held, got to the landing, and turned around. That was extraordinary, that she didn't just keep walking and hope that whatever they fire at her doesn't hit her. She stopped, gave them a target, and turned around and looked at this expanse of seething humanity, yelling at her, 2, 4, 6, 8, we don't want to integrate. To Kempton, she seemed, and this is straight, if you don't mind, from the race beat, so guileless, so lacking in affectation, so innately without a glimmer of flamboyance. Her quiet strength inspired Kempton, left him marveling at her courage, but at something else. And it led him to write a sentence that I have not been able to get out of my head in the 20 years since I read it. It's absolutely the loveliest line, slightly tortured as sometimes Murray Kempton could be in his writing. I want to edit him, I want to straighten it out, but it's still a lovely line and an extraordinary sentiment when he wrote, having witnessed this and in awe of her. He writes, "What is this extraordinary resource of this otherwise unhappy country that it breeds such dignity in its victims?" Let me read that again. What is this extraordinary resource of this otherwise unhappy country that it breeds such dignity in its victims? And that's the word. That's the something else besides courage. That's its dignity. And I have to say that I cannot think of any of the people I met, the African Americans I met in researching the book, the Civil Rights Cold Cases Project, or putting together Buried Truths, who consider themselves victims. Okay? Not as we think of it today. But we know what Kempton meant. African Americans in this otherwise unhappy country have found extraordinary and remarkable ways to extract dignity from their horrific experiences. And those of you who have listened to Season 1 of Buried Truths heard that dignity in the words and the voice of Dorothy Nixon Williams, Isaiah Nixon's daughter, who was 6 when she saw her father shot and killed for voting, who saw the bullets hitting his body as her mother was yelling from the porch, "Fall, Isaiah, fall!" thinking that might save his life. But he wouldn't, or he couldn't, until gravity pulled him down. You heard that dignity in Dover Carter's son, Aaron, when he was young and described how he was young and saw his father shortly after he was brutally beaten because he had voted. And if you heard it, then you heard that very emotional moment when he stood over his mother's grave and recalled how all those years later, from 1948 to 2008, she lived a life of fear about the vote, but belief in the vote. And then in 2008, what did she get an opportunity to do? To vote for Barack Obama. And then she died 5 days later. And you heard it in James Harris as he told the story of his father's response when he was warned not to vote. You heard a little bit of that here. The sheriff-elect had told John Harris on Election Day 1948, "If you know what's best for you, you won't vote today." And how did John Harris respond? He looked at the sheriff, who he'd known for years, who he actually liked. He wasn't afraid of him. And he said very matter-of-factly and without hostility, "Well, I came here to vote, and I reckon that's what I'm going to do." And so he did. He voted with dignity and courage. Let me talk a bit. I want to jump to contrition before I talk about cowardice, okay? Because that gets a little more complex. But contrition is something that in the time I've spent working on some of these cold cases here in Georgia, in Alabama, in Mississippi, with other journalists over there in Louisiana, we see come again and again with people who are now in their 80s who have come to realize that their days are numbered and they are worried that all the evil things they did back in those days, where they would go night riding on a Saturday, and you know where they'd be on Sunday morning? Of course, they'd be in church. And all those lessons from church, if they weren't from a white supremacist pastor, took a long time to sink in. But in their 80s, they have started to sink in. And they're realizing, what I have done in my life does not assure that I am going up. In fact, it probably assures I'm going to hell. And they are seeking to stop that juggernaut before it happens. And so you had Elwyn Wilson A man in Rock Hill, South Carolina, show up at Congressman John Lewis's office several years ago. And John Lewis isn't sure who he is, and Elwyn Wilson says, well, you don't remember me probably. You remember when you took that freedom ride to Rock Hill and you got off the bus? Yeah. You remember when someone whacked you over the head? John Lewis said something to the effect, well, I remember it up to the point that it hit my head, yes, you know. He said, that was me, and I'm here to apologize for what I did. And he went on to confess doing other things. He lived on a street where the black kids would come on the way to school, would walk, and he would hang little black effigies in the tree that they would have to walk by. And I think it was his son that ultimately persuaded him to act on his own instinct, which is to come clean. And he did. You've heard the stories out of LaGrange, Georgia, where the police chief has apologized for something he wasn't involved in, but the police force was, in a cold case there where the police did not act when they could have. And one of my favorite stories, 1964, Freedom Summer, right, in Mississippi. It's when all the young people, my students' ages, are going down to Mississippi for Freedom Summer, open up freedom schools, freedom libraries. It's a great spirited and scary prospect of what's going to happen to them. And on the opening day of Freedom Summer, what does the Klan do? They send a message by killing Michael Schwerner, Andrew Goodman, and James Chaney down in Philadelphia, Mississippi, in Neshoba County. The opening day. And they're missing for 44 days, okay? And during that 44 days, the governor of Mississippi is saying, Ross Barnett, and if I weren't so dry, I'd really try my imitation of Ross Barnett's voice, but he talked like this, you know. He says, those boys aren't missing. They're not missing. They're down in Cuba with Fidel Castro having a pina colada and laughing at us. But they were missing for 44 days. And President Johnson sent in sailors, to dredge every body of water in South Mississippi looking for those three guys. One black, two white. They get over on the other side of the state, and they're at an offshoot of the Mississippi River, and they pull up a body, and it's a black person, a black male. And they think, that's James Chaney. Then they pull up another body, also black, wrong configuration. This can't be Schwerner, Goodman, and Chaney. It's somebody else. It was Henry Hezekiah D. and Charles Moore, two 19-year-old college students who had hitchhiked through Meadville when they got picked up by the Klan based on ignorance. A Klansman saw that Henry Hezekiah D. was wearing a do-rag over his hair, a bandana, and he starts saying, that's one of them, I think that's one of them Muslims, he was just he didn't know what he was talking about, so they kidnap him. They take them out to a forested area where they strap and tie them to a tree, and they pull out these long reeds, and they just start whipping them and torturing them, and then they shoot them, and they're all but dead. When one of the Klansmen leaves, I guess he had to go to work, and another Klansman finishes the job, throwing him into the trunk of his car, taking him down to an offshoot of the Mississippi River, tying one to an engine block, the other to railroad ties, and throws them both into this offshoot of the Mississippi River where they drown. And that was in 1964. And that case went unsolved, unpunished, till the mid-2000s. Okay? And it became, the corrective came when a reporter from the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, David Ridgen, paired up with Charles Moore's brother, Thomas Moore, who had gone off to a career in the military, in the Army, and David Ridgen persuaded Thomas Moore to go back to Mississippi with him and help solve what happened, find out who's alive, who can still pay a price. Everyone said James Ford Seal, the Klansman who ultimately did that, threw them in the water, was dead, but they found out he wasn't dead, and they found out that Charles Marcus Edwards, the other Klansman, was worth pursuing again and again to get him to come clean. He's the one who left the scene, and they ultimately did. And Charles Marcus Edwards told them the whole story. Then Charles Marcus Edwards told the U.S. Attorney, Dunn Lamp, a Republican, U.S. attorney over there, and then Dunlampton brought him before a grand jury, and he told the whole story there, and then he goes to trial. James Ford Seal goes to trial, and the chief witness against him is going to be Charles Marcus Edwards, and he tells the whole story of what they did. And at the end of that, the judge, Judge Henry Wingate, one of the few African-American federal judges in the South, says, "Thank you for your testimony, Mr. Edwards. You may step down." And he just looks up, he says, "Your Honor, can I say something else?" And I wasn't in the courtroom, but you can just imagine that you could hear the lawyers' sphincters tighten, because they didn't know what was coming, right? And so the judge excused the jury, and then Charles Marcus Edwards, in his rather backwoodsy way, wants to apologize to the families. And he also wants to acquit the two boys in a way. He says, "I just want you to know that your boys didn't do nothing to deserve what we did to them. They didn't do nothing. They were just in town and we grabbed them." And he apologizes for what he did. And he goes on. And finally, the judge says, "Thank you." The jury goes and deliberates. And while the jury is deliberating, Thomas More, the Army guy, and he is a big, big guy, goes and knocks on the door of Charles Marcus Edwards at a hotel. And I've seen a video of all this. And Charles Marcus Edwards finally shows that he's not there. He finally shows up because Thomas Moore's just waiting by the door. And Charles Marcus Edwards shows up, and Thomas More goes up to him, and he says, "Mr. Edwards, I just want you to know that I forgive you. I always said that if anyone would come and tell the truth, I would forgive them. And you told the truth, and I forgive you." And Thomas starts quoting scripture where Jesus says, "I forgive you 7 times, no 7 times 70. And as he's doing that, Charles Marcus Edwards, in harmony, begins saying the exact same passage. Okay? Since that time, by the way, that shortly after that, they get the call, the jury is in, the jury convicts James Ford Seal, they put him in jail, he dies in jail. Since that time, Charles Marcus Edwards, the Klansman, has brought Thomas More back to Meadville to go to his church with him. And Thomas More has had the opportunity to console and comfort Mr. Edwards on the loss of his son. Okay? So there was an incredible expression of contrition and, if I might use the word, reconciliation. It happens. It happens, and we should never give up on that. Let me just talk briefly about cowardice. It abounded in the South. We know that. Men and women wearing hoods to hide their identity. Snipers hiding behind bushes to assassinate Medgar Evers and wound James Meredith. Klansmen racing their cars at high speed at night to run blacks off the road, forcing their cars to crash fatally into buildings or trees. There was another toxic form of cowardice. White thought leaders who were in a position to express themselves against demagoguery, the madness of violent racism, against the constant public humiliation and dehumanization of others, and didn't do it. These would include newspaper editors who remained silent while Lillian Smith and Ralph McGill and Harding Carter were not. Back in the 1950s, McGill and the other editors were reevaluating a long-held journalistic tenet that, had this evaluation come sooner, when it came to Southern editors covering race, might have led to a different outcome. That one tenet that McGill began reevaluating was objectivity. We grew up thinking that a news organization's number 2 goal was objectivity. The first is to find and report the news, and 2 was to assess and write the information objectively. But the truth is, objectivity neutered reporters and news organizations, and it handcuffed them. And we found that, as McGill himself noted in 1959 in a speech, we found that in the coverage of Joe McCarthy. If Joe McCarthy boasted that in my pocket here I have the names of 23 communists working inside the State Department or the New York Times, editors would not allow reporters to challenge him or his information or to try to ferret out the truth of that unless they could find someone who was willing to be quoted as a challenge to McCarthy. It would be considered unbiased to initiate your own examination of what he was saying. It would be considered not objective to scrutinize and investigate his claim. And McGill, in a speech in 1959, decried practices that he believed were holding back honest reporting. He, and I'm quoting, if you don't mind, from the Race Beat, I think I can plagiarize myself here, proselytized his fellow journalists with the idea that they had become mindless, robotic followers of the cult of objectivity at the expense of truth. Certainly, reporters had to try to be fair, McGill felt, but he did not see the point of purely objective news presentations if that meant the truth got lost in the process. Objectivity, he believed, was an anachronistic antidote that had emerged in earlier days when publishers had been wild and reckless in pushing their biases into the newspapers. And it had evolved into a formula of printing all sides of the story, sometimes in the exact same number of words and paragraphs, and leaving readers to make their own choices, building false equivalencies along the way. From there, McGill felt, the goal of objectivity had devolved to the point where newspapers had become neutered. If a public figure said something that was untrue or mischaracterized the situation, McGill felt, most newspapers wouldn't report the falsity unless the reporter could get someone else to point it out. And if that someone else then stretched the truth, McGill said, newspapers devoted to blind objectivity found themselves in a bind, printing two falsities. And an example that I saw in my research was if citizens council leaders in a town, white citizens council leaders, said they were not putting economic pressure on Negroes to withdraw their names from petitions, and the newspaper had incontrovertible proof that they were, why were newspapers so reluctant to report it? Why did they have to wait until they found someone who was willing to say it on the record? Why did they fall back on that conventional thrust and parry of grouping the allegation and the denial all in the first couple of paragraphs, which steered readers away from the truth, not toward it? Well, guess where we are now? McGill's hope, perhaps prophecy, has come true, and newspapers are not holding back now. They are going after the truth, and they are challenging the canards, and they are challenging the lies. And it's worth knowing, by the way, that that journalism as a whole has come that way. It's worth knowing the Society of Professional Journalists, sort of the leading organization of journalists out there, dropped objectivity as a desired component of its code of ethics some 25 years ago. The code calls for fairness and accuracy, but not objectivity. And for that, we can be happy. And we can celebrate those newspapers and news organizations that are not afraid to dig out the truth, to trust their readers, to throw away the tape measure they use to give everyone equal space. One last thought from a Georgia journalist. I think of this when I open my newspapers every morning. I get 3 of them on my driveway: the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal. 2 of those have vigorous editorial pages, vigorous editorials that reflect the strong feelings of their editorial boards, the New York Times editorial board and the Wall Street Journal editorial board. The 3rd newspaper, which took this action after I left, the paper of Ralph McGill, Gene Patterson, Cynthia Tucker, has no opinion about anything on its editorial page. It never expresses its belief about anything. Occasionally on Sunday, it will do that, but very rarely and never during the week. And it used to be every day of the week, 2 or 3 editorials, okay? It aggregates the opinions of others, but it has no view of its own. Now, that's its right. But I am reminded of the words of another Georgia editor, Julian Harris, some of you may know, son of Joel Chandler Harris, who with his wife Julia ran the Columbus, Georgia Enquirer-Sun. In 1925, they traveled to cover the Scopes trial, the monkey trial in Dayton, Tennessee. And that year they wrote strong editorials against the activities of the Ku Klux Klan. And for that work, they and their small daily newspaper in Columbus won the Pulitzer Prize for Public Service, the top Pulitzer Prize, even bigger than the Pulitzer Prize for History, okay? Sorry, that was the one I won. That was history, okay. Right. And they won that in 1926.
We have time for just a few questions if anybody has any. Any questions? Yes, ma'am.
I wondered if you could say which media outlets, whether they're digital or print, you think are covering current events in the best way, the fairest way, the most accurate way?
Well, which media organizations are covering the news in the best way and the most fairest way, maybe most comprehensive, if I can throw that in? There are quite a few, and we have an embarrassment of riches right now. You know, I'm sorry, I'm just not going around feeling all that sad about where we are today. What we grew up with, newspapers are hurting, okay? And that does sadden me, okay? But, you know, we have so many other news organizations that have cropped up. And for my students, it means jobs, which is good, you know. So I think what's happened is that we have, the burden has shifted back to us to become more active readers and to seek out the news more assertively ourselves. And I mean, certainly I think the New York Times is extraordinary. And you know, they are not just doing it on Donald Trump and Russia investigation and Supreme Court. Look at what they did about the incredible loss of land in Louisiana, that extraordinary series that Kevin Sack, who lives here, worked on, or what they've done on so many other topics, the special they did on the collusion, which, you know, connected a lot of dots. The climate change coverage that they have done is phenomenal. I mean, so I'm in awe of what they're doing at great cost. But you know what they have found out, as has the Washington Post, that the more money they invest in it, the more money they make. Okay? Because their circulation is up, their eyeballs on their website are up, and people and advertisers will pay more to get in the paper or on their website. So the Washington Post, like NBC News, I think is doing great. But I mean, CBS is no slouch. ABC is no slouch. But then there's Axios, and then there's, you know, the Huffington Post for whatever you're looking for. And if you really want to know what's going on the right side of things, and you want to hear hardcore opinion, there's Fox News. Okay, I think CNN is not as hardcore and left as Fox is right. You know, but the tone has changed over time as to what, you know, an anchor, you know, will say. And, you know, so a Don Lemon is really pretty out there with his opinion, you know. Of course, MSNBC I like to see, because not only does Rachel Maddow get out there with her opinion, but she does incredible investigative work, as do others on MSNBC. So I think we have a good opportunity now, I mean, for channel surfing. Thank goodness they invented the remote control. If only they can make it work so we can just blink our eyes and it'll change, you know. Another question?
Question over here.
Yes, sir.
As you look, if I may, in society, and how everything has changed in the paper, and I'm going to use a good example, if I could, the Kavanaugh hearing versus what happened with Bill Cosby. Are you concerned as to how people, when they write these stories, and how they know they influence society and things of that nature? You follow what I mean?
Well, I understand the question, but I have the impression that there's something behind your question that you want to say. Why don't you tell me what you think, and I'll tell you, and I'll respond to that.
Well, let's just say, you know, I know as a child who has So I know throughout history, it has been one to where typically, as far as a black man, is not going to get viewed as objectively as they should, you know, and I say that just to say, you know, you look at this example, you got one guy sentenced to prison today, another one.
I see.
who
So I
has
see.
the possibility
Right, right.
of being made a Supreme Court justice.
Right, right. Well, you know, the high ground that I would seek in response to that is that Bill Cosby was convicted.
True.
He was tried and convicted.
True.
Charged, tried, and convicted, and it took 2 trials. But Brett Kavanaugh has not been criminally charged. He's not been convicted of anything. And I think we're all just sort of waiting to see how this thing turns out. They're not equivalents. They're just not. And there was a series of women involved on the Cosby thing. Only in the last day or so have we gotten the impression that there been the allegation that there may be a series of people with Kavanaugh. But we'll just have to see how that. 2 weeks from now, you and I may say, okay, I got what you're saying. You know, we just don't know enough.
One more question. Yes, sir.
The Morris Ford Bridge lynchings.
Yes.
The investigation of that was suspended last year.
Right.
Presumably, and everybody kind of knows it there, the people who did are still alive. What's your opinion on where that goes now, if anywhere?
On Morris Ford, he's saying that case was closed last year, and he's saying when everyone knows that the perpetrators are still alive. And let me say that there are plenty of people who know more about that case than I do. The reason my class, I have not examined the Morris Ford case in my class, is because so many other people have. There's a book out there, you know, by Laura Wexler. There's, you know, Tyrone Brooks is out there every year. There's been a lot that's done on that. But no one had done Isaiah Nixon, and no one had done James Brazier, and no one had done A.C. Hall, and no one had done Clarence Pickett or Lemuel Penn. Some had done, yes. So I am not the expert in it, but I don't think that I am comfortable. I would not go out of here saying, based on what you've said, that the perpetrators are still alive. I'm not sure that that's true. I know that there have been some sightings of some people who, like the young boy who might have seen it, and maybe he's still alive. I've read everything on it, but I'm not completely sure. And if you're saying perpetrators or witnesses who may be still alive, we'd have to distinguish on that. But if you're saying in the plural that perpetrators are still alive, I'm saying I'm not so sure I know that. Are you sure that they're still alive?
Well, I've been to the reenactment a couple of times, and, you know, it's really hard to tell when you're talking with people what they know or what they think they know. However, it's common knowledge that amongst the population of people there that these few people were present at the time of the lynching. And that,
Present.
well, present,
Actively involved?
you know, that's where you get into the how do you work out.
Right, right.
But
And
the complicit behavior
Right.
in a case like that is pretty much the same
Right.
as pulling a trigger, for instance. It may be mitigated somewhat, but still it's a thing. And so the people there do believe that those folks are still alive. And, you know, and I guess the question is more directed at this idea that the intransience, this reluctance to seek out and finally get justice. I mean, it's great when somebody comes and sees Congressman Lewis and says, I'm sorry for what I did. But that's really, in my experience, more the exception than the rule.
Oh.
The rule is these people hunker down and they stick to their literal guns.
well, I think that that's certainly possible, because to not stick to their guns is probably to spend the rest of their lives in jail, as you know, Bobby Frank Cherry did, who, and in the Birmingham church bombing, or Tom Blanton did, the Birmingham church bombing, and all these other cases. There are people who went to jail when, you know. So, but I would say that there is a real difference. If you're in law enforcement, there's a real difference between witnessing something and being complicit. If there's no living perpetrator, there has to be a living perpetrator. That's why the Carolyn Bryant story that came out on the Emmett Till case, you know, Carolyn Bryant, who for years everyone knew she was part and parcel of the kidnapping of Emmett Till, that her husband and brother-in-law show up at the home of Mose Wright and said, we want the boy who talked to that woman, you know, and they take him away. And Mose Wright hears them take Emmett Till and stand him in front of somebody in the truck and say, is this the boy what talked to you? And a woman says, yes, that's him. Emmett Till is killed that night, beaten to death, stabbed to death, shot to death, 70-pound cotton gin fan around his neck, thrown into the Tallahatchie River. If all the perpetrators are dead, let me back it up. Bryant and Milam were tried. It was not a fair trial, but they had an honest judge and they had an honest prosecutor. I've not heard people challenge the integrity of the judge or the prosecutor, but it was an all-white jury. They all knew everybody, and there was no way that they were going to get a conviction. So they are found not guilty. So Carolyn Bryant, all these years later, apparently to Tim Tyson, recants and said, he didn't really mess with me. He didn't grab me. He didn't do all these things, okay? Tim Tyson held on to that information for years before he released it, okay? I do understand that just last week, and I'd have to double check this, she has talked to Jerry Mitchell over in Jackson, Mississippi, the Simon Wiesenthal of the South, the #1 cold case, the Klan cold case hunter in the South. And she said, no, I didn't recant. So it gets confusing, you know. But what could she be charged with today? What could she be charged? It's a great story if she recants. But and when Jeff Sessions says, I'm going to reopen the case and see if we can criminally prosecute her, of what? Perjury? There's a statute of limitations on that. Accomplice of the crime, statute of limitations. And plus, if there's been no crime, there can be no accomplice. The crime means adjudication of a crime. So we can get all caught up in this, or we can think, well, maybe Jeff Sessions was just trying to distract our attention from something. I have no idea what it could be. You know, I will say this. I have been very critical of the FBI. I wrote an op-ed piece in the Washington Post some years ago that said they're not really serious about all this cold case stuff. I've just seen too many cases when they just really didn't respond to obvious evidence that journalists had about perpetrators who were still alive. But by now, they're almost all dead, you know, and maybe all are dead, but most all dead. To my mind, that's when professors and journalists enter to preserve the story and to tell the story, even if somebody cannot be ultimately prosecuted and convicted for that crime, that history can prosecute them and history can convict them. And we ought to pursue those stories, and that's a driving force behind the Georgia Civil Rights Cold Cases Project and the podcast. So, thank
you. So nobody asked the question. Nobody asked the question, but what, if anything, can you tell us about season 2?
Season 2. I'll get in trouble with my betters at WABE. But it involves a 17-year-old high school kid who was walking with his girlfriend at night in October in Macon, and little do they know that a white woman has reported that a gun is missing from her husband's car. Police pick her and her husband up to go look for a colored man she says she saw near her husband's car. And they come upon Isaiah Nixon, and the police react to her claim that that's him there, and the police react, and I'm going to have to tell you, overreact before they even get out of their car and begin firing their guns. But it's a story about police privilege in the state, some extraordinary things we found about privileges that police had that we don't have, okay? It's about a science that used to exist, that didn't exist back then and certainly didn't play itself in courts of law, but that is the difficulties of cross-racial identification, particularly at night in October. There are a lot of lessons from it. You know, I mean, the first season was not just about who done it. It's about stopping to talk about, you know, the consistency with which white people got away with the alibi of self-defense. And you'll hear that in this podcast as well, second season. The police say something that will make you say, isn't that what the police said in the Laquan McDonald story case in Chicago? Isn't that what the police officer said in North Charleston? Isn't that what the police officer said? And, you know, and it just goes down the list. And you cannot help but wonder, and I've already said so much more than I was allowed to, you cannot help but wonder if we had been dutiful as a people in prosecuting those stories back then, if we'd been law and order back then and not let people get away with it, might we not be having the problems we're having today, because police officers would know there's a price to pay if you do that. So,
Please help join me one last time in showing appreciation to our president.